My captors, the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, took out their AQ franchise in January '07. But they'd been fighting for almost 20 years under different names. They began as the Islamic Salvation Front Army, and then they became the Groupe Islamique Armé, GIA, and then they became the GSPC. And they entered into negotiations with Al-Qaeda in September '06, and they lasted 3 months, and there was a great then celebration on the internet of exchanges of greetings between the AQIM gang and al-Zawahiri in the Tora Bora, or wherever he was. And the fact of taking out the franchise did change their method of operation, change their priorities somewhat. For 20 years, they had been fighting what they saw as the apostate government of Algiers and hoping to overthrow it and replace it with the beginning of their grand caliphate. After they took out the AQ franchise, they became more interested, not exclusively, but more interested in attacking Westerners and Western targets, Western companies in Algiers, aid workers, missionaries, and above all, the UN. They blew up UN headquarters in December '07 in Algiers. That follows AQ in Mesopotamia, blowing up UN headquarters in Baghdad in '03. And just a month ago, they blew up UN headquarters in Nigeria, in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, killing 23 people and wounding 80. They really hate the UN. They grabbed me because I was a UN guy, not because I was a Canadian. That was just an added bonus. It convinced me, I mean, in the book, A Season in Hell, I describe them and their motivations and indicate that, in my experience, they're the most single-minded group of people I've ever met. They weren't like other groups of young men I'd seen before. They didn't care about cool sunglasses or neat shoes or nickel plating their calashes. They wanted to get to heaven as fast and as expeditiously as possible. They hoped very much to die in their cause. The Prophet had said that 99 out of 100 shall not pass, but they would, because they were on jihad. They were dying in God's service, performing His holy will. They would say to me, you fight to go home to your wives and children, and we fight to die. And so we will prevail. It may not happen soon, but it will happen. They were absolutely convinced that they would win, and I am absolutely convinced that they will not soon be defeated. They're moving southwards, and from Al-Shabaab in Somalia, they're moving westwards. They're moving deep into Mauritania, and now, in cooperation with Boko Haram in Nigeria, they are threatening to significantly destabilize Africa's most populous country and the powerhouse of the northern half of Africa, and that has truly unsettling implications. Many people use phrases like, well, no more than 1% of Muslims espouse these enormously radical beliefs, but 1% still is a pretty big number. And we have to be vigilant about that. It would be extremely irresponsible not to be. That said, Canada has great friends in Africa, and we have nurtured those relationships for ages. If my captors achieve their vision of a sort of 7,000-kilometer wide band of instability across the Sahel from Nouakchott to Mogadishu, rendering it, as they hoped, one vast Somalia, a hotbed of anarchy and chaos in which growth medium, their jihad, will flourish, they believe. That will have enormous implications for Africa, and that would have implications for Europe, and we should care. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, I guess my main message is be careful, look before you leap. We're in an age that doesn't think long about anything, and I find that too bad. It would be nice if we thought a little bit first. Beware of the law of unintended consequences. Libya seemed like a fine idea. What is excruciatingly clear at the moment is, while we have rid ourselves of the wicked witch Gaddafi, our actions have caused one of the most unstable regions in the world to become awash with enormous quantities of sometimes sophisticated weapons. And the core of Gaddafi's African mercenaries were Tuareg. They were the core of his Islamic Legion in the 70s. They have returned home with pockets full of cash, with sophisticated and great quantities of weaponry, with very bloody hands. They've never been particularly anxious to accept the sovereignty of any of the countries through which they roam, and they will do so even less now, I would think. In addition to that, I mean, the UN Security Council 2 weeks ago called for the Transitional Council to get hold of all those weapon sites. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of sites that haven't even been inspected. In something like 20,000 SA-24 missiles are missing. SA-24 is like the US Stinger. In addition to that, unbelievable quantities of heavy anti-tank mines, heavy artillery shells, heavy mortar shells have been liberated. Thousands of them. You put 4 or 5 of those guys in the trunk of a car and half a pound of plastic, and you have a devastating weapon. And they will use that. The other thing that happened when they took out the Al-Qaeda franchise is they developed a line in martyr operations, suicide bombing, which they hadn't used before. Now they do. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to the head of CBC News at the time, John Cruikshank, who was called, he volunteered to me. He was called once or twice a day by a senior officer of the Canadian government to brief him on the status of Melissa Fung. When my wife, I mean, Louis and I had 75 years experience combined working for the Canadian government, mostly for the Department of Foreign Affairs. We were part of the Foreign Service family. In the department's propaganda, they spent a lot of time talking about the community of Foreign Service and how we have to see it in the holistic way, etc. Well, I mean, if the point is to encourage young Foreign Service officers or aid workers or NGOs to go into harm's way and into risky places and do good work, I think you're going to have to treat them carefully and more responsibly. Why the RCMP felt they could not even tell Mary we were alive when they knew we were alive within days is beyond comprehension. I now know, I've spoken literally to dozens of people in Ottawa. Ottawa's a small town. Dozens of people who were talking about our alive status between Christmas and New Year's. We were kidnapped on the 14th of December, between Christmas and New Year's, and Mary wasn't told we were alive until February. And as you said, the person who actually told her was Ban Ki-moon. Up to then, they'd said things like, well, we don't know they're dead. I mean, that didn't give her great comfort. People in our families were mourning our death.